there's this thing about fever. There was a story I read a few years ago, and it always stuck with me. It was a story about a man who went to the dentist because he was in excruciating pain. And when he got to the dentist told him that he had an infection. But this man did not have health insurance. And so when he was given two medications, one was a painkiller and one was an antibiotic, he could only choose one of them. And so, like many of us, he chose the painkiller. He just didn't want to feel the pain anymore. He wanted to be numb. And so what happened is he took the painkiller so he didn't have to feel that anymore. But what happened to the infection? Well, the infection wasn't being addressed. Because he did not address the infection, it actually spread to his brain, and this gentleman ended up dying of the infection. Now, why did this story stick with me so much? This is a true story. The reason it stuck with me is because it was so symbolic of what happens to us in our lives. When we are in pain, either individually or collectively as a community or globally or as an ummah, we tend to just try to treat the symptoms. We just want the pain to go away, but we don't actually treat the root cause of that disease. See, there's a thing about fever. When you have a fever, and this is something me and my husband have recently been experiencing a lot of, when you have a fever, you can take a lot of fever reducer. You can take Tylenol, you can take ibuprofen. But the fever itself is an indication of another problem. It's one thing to try to numb our pains in life. And it's another thing to actually go and look at why are we sick. And that's what I want to talk about today. As an ummah, we're sick. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the ummah is like one body. And when any single part of that body is in pain or is sick, the entire body breaks out in fever. The fever is an indication that there's a sickness. We are in pain as an ummah. We are in pain all over the world. We are in pain here. We are in pain individually in our lives. We are in pain collectively. We are in pain politically. But the question we have to ask is, why do we have this fever? Why are we in pain? What is the sickness that is causing this pain? Now, I've divided the causes of sickness into two kinds. One, the body gets sick and weak when it is deprived of its ultimate needs. That's one of the reasons why the body becomes sick and weak, is when we deprive the body of its most essential needs, it becomes weak and it becomes sick. The second reason why the body becomes weak and sick is when a disease hits. Now, I want to address the first reason first, and that is the deprivation. Now, just like the body, our hearts become sick when we deprive our hearts of the most essential need that the heart has, and that is the spiritual oxygen. What is our spiritual oxygen that we are collectively being deprived of? That is the remembrance of Allah, dhikr, our salah. We have deprived our hearts of the oxygen that the heart needs to stay alive. If a person isn't praying, it's like a person who isn't breathing. We have deprived ourselves of the remembrance of Allah in our lives, and as a result, we have become sick. We have become sick as individuals, and we have become sick as an ummah. The remembrance of Allah is the oxygen, the food and the water of the heart. And so because we are depriving ourselves of that, our hearts have become sick collectively. Now, the other reason why the heart becomes sick and weak and eventually can die is when diseases hit the heart. Now, what are some of the diseases that we are being plagued with as an ummah, as a community, and as individuals? The first sickness I want to talk about is a sickness that the Prophet ﷺ warned us about more than 1400 years ago. In a very, very profound hadith, he says to his companions, there will come a day, your enemies will soon gather one another to attack you, like people gather one another to eat from their dish, to share from their dish. And they asked, is it going to be because we're weak in number or small in number? And he says, no, you will not be small in number. In fact, you will be large in number. But you will become like the froth on the ocean. You know, just those little, the bubbles, the froth, the scum that happens, that builds on top of the waves. It doesn't have any weight. It goes wherever the tide takes it. And he says that the fear will be taken out of the hearts of your enemies, and in your hearts will be put a disease, something called Wahan. And they asked him, what is Wahan? And he defined it as Hubb Dunya wa Karahiyatul Maut. It is the love of dunya. Now the reason why this hadith is literally prophecy is because it describes the weakness that will come to our ummah. And he says the enemies will gather one another to attack you. And these attacks that we're seeing right now, they're all different forms. In some places in the world, they're physical, and in some places, they are spiritual, mental, psychological. Islamophobia is a machine. These are the types of attacks that we are seeing right now. You know, it's become cool. It's become acceptable. In fact, it has become something that will give you political capital to attack Islam and Muslims. It has become an acceptable social capital type of bigotry. The Prophet ﷺ diagnosed this issue. He said, Hubb Dunya wa Karahiyatul Maut. The love of dunya is a disease that's going to make us politically weak. That's what this hadith is saying. It's a disease, but what kind of disease is it? It's a spiritual disease. What is Hubb Dunya? The love of this life. What does it mean to love dunya? What does it mean to love dunya? Does it mean that we're not allowed to have nice things? Does it mean we're not allowed to have jobs and get married and have nice houses? Of course we can. In fact, there were many companions who were extremely wealthy. But the problem is that the dunya has taken over our hearts. Hubb dunya becomes a disease when you don't own your stuff owns you. You don't own your money owns you. You don't own your status owns you. You don't own your power owns you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد. Know that the life of this world is play, amusement. You know what's very interesting about this ayah? Is when you break down this ayah, from Surah Al-Hadid, you find that this ayah is a chronological timeline of our life in this world, of the things that matter most to us in this world. Because when we first come into this life, what's the most important thing to us as a child? It's play. If you want to get a present for a little child and you drop $1,000 on a Armani suit, they're really not going to care. But if you spend 50 cents on a rattle, they'll be happy. And this is because what matters most when you first come into this dunya is just, I want to play. لعب. اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو. And then you get a little bit older and now you're kind of like in late elementary, middle school. And now the most important thing to you, anyone who has people in that age, any children in that age group, what's their favorite thing to say? I'm bored. And the reason for that is because at that age, They want to be entertained, constantly stimulated and entertained. And that's because at that point, the most important thing to them is entertainment, amusement. This is called lahu in the Quran. And Allah says after la'ib, He says lahu, la'ibun wa lahun wa zina. Then you get a little bit older. And what is hubb ad-dunya about when you're in high school? Well, pretty much it's about what you look like, what you're wearing. This is the time when people are so concerned about what they look like that this is when you see spikes in things like eating disorders, because what you look like becomes of utmost importance. And so here Allah says zina. Zina is adornment, looking good. لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ وَزِينَةٌ وَتَفَاخُرٌ بَيْنَكُمْ. Now you get a little bit older. And now it's not so much about your rattles and your video games or even your brand names. Now it's about proving yourself. Now it's about, how do I stack up next to someone else? What medical school are you getting into? How are your grades? And now it's tafakhurun bainakum. Now you're trying to show off. You're trying to compete. Then you get established. You get a big house, nice car, and children. And now what is it? وَتَكَاثُرٌ فِي الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ. Now it's about getting a lot or competing in the accumulation with regards to money and your children. But what's so interesting here is that Allah says all of this, He gives us an analogy. See, all of these are halal things, but these are the things we get caught up in. And each person is at a different stage in that dunya. But all of it, كَمَثَلِ غَيْثٍ أَعْجَبَ الْكُفَّارَ نَبَاتُهُ ثُمَّ يَهِيجُ فَتَرَاهُ مُصْفَرًّا. All of this stuff that we get so caught up in, it's like a heavy rain that makes the farmer super excited for a while. Because what happens, it brings vegetation. But then what happens to that vegetation? These things that we chase, what happens to it? It starts to crumble, becomes dry and yellow, and then it just becomes nothing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us that the life of this world isn't meant to be chased. It isn't meant to be loved in that way. And when you take hubb ad-dunya and you fill your heart with it, it actually causes all types of other spiritual diseases.